The Imprisoning War, no, not that one, this one, is one of the more elusive aspects of Tears of the Kingdom's story. While Link is off playing Bob the Builder, the princess is on an adventure of her own in Hyrule's ancient past, taking on the role of an advisor, learning to control her power, helping Minoru with her research, and of course trying to find a way back to her own time. But by far the most eventful part of Zelda's journey is bearing witness to the birth of the Demon King Ganondorf and the massive war that ensued shortly after. A war which engulfed the entire kingdom and culminated in a desperate standoff between her, Rauru, and the other sages. It's the catalyst for practically everything that happened in the thousands of years that followed. It gave rise to the entity known as Calamity Ganon. It led to the creation of the Guardians and the Divine Beast, the great calamity that wiped out most of Hyrule and almost led to the death of Link himself. And finally, the upheaval in Tears of the Kingdom. All of it was made possible due to the Imprisoning War and its outcome. However, for an event that carries so much significance, we don't really know all that much about the Imprisoning War. We know the major players in the conflict, we know the outcome, and a few small details here and there, but besides that, the game doesn't really go into too much depth, which was arguably one of the weaker aspects of Tears of the Kingdom storytelling. Despite all the hype surrounding Zelda's new look and her more adventurous spirit seen in the early footage, the princess once again ended up being sidelined for most of the story, which was a shame because if there's anything I wanted to learn more about, it's this ancient version of Hyrule. The landscape, the people, the culture, the power dynamic, and so on. But alas, we only got a very small glimpse of it all, spread out across a small handful of memories. But it seems that's about to change with Hyrule Warriors: Age of Imprisonment, a game that follows Zelda's journey into the ancient past in much more detail and hopefully fills in many of the gaps left behind by Tears of the Kingdom. So to celebrate the occasion, let's go through the events of the Imprisoning War in chronological order so we can see how it ultimately stacks up against Age of Imprisonment's story. After all, the game is being promoted as a canonical tale, unlike the previous Warriors titles, which were either confirmed to be non-canon by the Zelda team, or in the case of Age of Calamity, its canonicity has been left ambiguous at best. And speaking of Age of Calamity, I'm not going to make the same mistake I did before and devote hours and hours on highly detailed story predictions and gameplay scenarios because, well, we all know how that turned out. The game ended up having very little to do with the actual backstory of Breath of the Wild and was more of a what-if scenario than anything else. As such, I'm going to try to keep speculation to a minimum and mostly stick to what we know, which is all based on two sources: the game itself and the Japanese edition of Masterworks, Tears of the Kingdom's complimentary book released in the summer of last year. Anyway, enough with the introductions, let's get into the Imprisoning War. According to Masterworks, the Imprisoning War, also known as the Sealing War in Japanese, officially kicks off when Ganondorf takes on his demonic form, which corresponds to Memory 10 in Tears of the Kingdom titled The Birth of the Demon King. However, for the sake of context, I think it's only fitting that we cover at least some of the events that led up to this moment. After all, wars usually don't start out of nowhere, and here it's no different. So before the Kingdom of Hyrule as we know it was founded, there was an event known as the Pilgrimage of Exorcism, which is when the newlyweds Rauru and Sonia set out on a quest to purify the land of evil entities. Apparently there were these hotspots all across Hyrule, places from which demonic creatures entered into the mortal realm in an endless cycle and wreaked havoc on the people of the land. And so one day, Rauru basically decided,
I will shut that shit down, no exceptions.
Which they did. The duo traveled to each of these hotspots not only to eradicate any and all invaders present there, but to prevent the monsters from rising once again in the future. They also placed special purifying shrines in these locations to suppress whatever evil aura was causing this phenomena, giving birth to the Shrines of Light. And just as a fun fact, the term used in Japanese for this so-called evil aura is the same used for Demise's curse. Now, this pilgrimage is actually mentioned on one of the stone tablets from the Messages from an Ancient Era side quest, which are basically historical records left behind by a female servant of Rauru and Sonia. It reads, quote, "The king was late to come home this evening, so the queen shared tales of her land, of shrines of green glow." Of early days since Hyrule's founding have diverse monsters besieged and assaulted her realm. Unstopping in strife, they brought despair to folks' lives. King and Queen beset themselves to bring the scourge to an end. With might of light and power, they had been driven aback, and the royal couple made these shrines to seal them away. These holy seals are called Shrines of Light. Great King, Great Queen, I thank you. You fought when I was a maiden child, so that tomorrow could pass. End quote. Now, while we don't know how long this so-called pilgrimage lasted, or even when it happened exactly, the servant does mention that she was a child when this took place. So it actually wasn't all that long ago, only 1 or 2 decades tops. Either way, the pilgrimage was a big part of Raru's rise to power. As the book describes, it's what cemented him as a great leader and how he gained notoriety all across Hyrule. It's also how he earned the loyalty of many of the other factions like the Zora, Gorons, and Rito, who were no doubt more than happy to have their territories cleansed of monsters. The only exception, of course, were the Gerudo, who at this time had royalty of their own in the form of Ganondorf, a powerful yet arrogant leader who viewed Raru as kind of a usurper to his future kingdom. But regardless of Ganondorf's inner grievances, Raru would ascend the throne and established the Kingdom of Hyrule, with the Great Plateau serving as its capital. Now, from what we can tell, this is approximately when Zelda enters the scene. Hyrule Kingdom is still very young at this point, and by all accounts, Raru hasn't been king for very long. In fact, the country is yet to be fully united. While the other tribes have all accepted Raru as the new king of the land, the Gerudo have yet to recognize the new kingdom that rose up so suddenly in central Hyrule, and any and all invitations for an audience with the king and queen had been rejected. As Masterworks puts it, for the Gerudo tribe who preserved their kingdom's unique culture of strong military might and people rising to the top qualified by their power, Hyrule Kingdom, which borrowed Raru's power, was likely seen as nothing more than a temporary kingdom. In other words, Raru's kingdom was basically seen as weak and illegitimate by the Gerudo, which, to be fair, was kinda true to an extent. According to the book, the Gerudo were actually more technologically advanced during this time, and the Hylians did indeed rely heavily on the power of just one guy. As such, in true Gerudo fashion, it wouldn't be long until this apparent weakness would be put to the test, which led to the first hostilities between the two kingdoms. Not long after Zelda's arrival, a swarm of Molduga unexpectedly attacks the capital, an attack which, as we all know from Memory 6, the Gerudo Assault, was actually orchestrated by Ganondorf and some of his loyalists. While the attack itself didn't do any damage and was easily repelled by Raru, Sonia, and Zelda, it was more or less a test of Hyrule's defenses, as opposed to an all-out assault. In fact, Masterworks states that the Hylians didn't even bother to investigate the source behind the attack, and seem to have brushed it off as a freak accident, though rumor has it that Hyrule's leadership did know, or at least had strong suspicions that the Gerudo were the ones behind it, but chose not to escalate tensions any further. More importantly, it's at this moment that Ganondorf bears witness to the potential of the Zonai's secret stones, magical artifacts capable of greatly amplifying the power of its user. And so, realizing that his army is no match for the awesome power of King Raru, Ganondorf decides to switch tactics. Which brings us to memory number 7, a show of fealty. Having previously ignored Hyrule's repeated invitations, the Gerudo suddenly appear to have a change of heart, and unexpectedly agree to a meeting. Before long, Ganondorf shows up at the castle with a small delegation of his people, including this new incarnation of Kaome and Kotake, which I definitely hope to see more of in Age of Imprisonment. Anyway, it's during this meeting that the Gerudo King formally declares his allegiance to Raru, albeit passive-aggressively, meaning that henceforth Ganondorf himself and his kingdom officially become a vassal of Hyrule. And yes, according to Masterworks, this is what the power structure was right before the war. Raru's kingdom is described as a nation-state whose rule extends across all territories, meaning that all the other tribes are vassal states, or a vassal kingdom in the Gerudo's case. It's a bit like in Game of Thrones, where you have several semi-independent kingdoms unified under a single ruler, which I guess would make the Great Plateau King's Landing, and Raru, well, actually never mind. Now, following Ganondorf's Pledge of Allegiance and the vassalization of the Gerudo Kingdom, there's actually an extended period of time of peace and stability in Hyrule, a time in which Ganondorf lay low and all the factions, including the Gerudo, lived in harmony, trading, visiting each other's territories, exchanging culture, and so on. This is by far the most underdeveloped part of the ancient Hyrule story arc, and I would argue that the memory system is largely to blame for this. See, the memories make it seem like Ganondorf's fake loyalty and his subsequent betrayal take place in pretty quick succession. But if we are to believe Masterworks, there's actually a lot more time between these events than the memories let on. Zelda lived among these people not for days or weeks, but months, maybe even years. I mean, just between arriving in the past and the start of the Imprisoning War, she had enough time to control her power through Sonia's teachings, she experimented with ancient Zonai tech, and even helped Minoru investigate and restore functionality to the construct factory, something I imagine wasn't done in a day or two. In other words, Zelda wasn't just hanging around waiting to go home. She built a life here. But you don't really get that impression from just the memories alone. They're simply too short and few and far between. Not to mention that the memories mostly focus on a few key characters only, and barely show the other tribes and how they interacted with each other. That and the fact that everything regarding Raru's background, his deeds, his philosophy, his rise to kingship, and the overall power structure of his kingdom are all painted with the broadest brush possible, and it's no surprise why the ancient past narrative felt rushed and underdeveloped in some areas. As a result, it makes Raru come off as a bit of a buffoon, too stupid to see that the obviously evil bad guy was clearly gonna betray him at some point, and that he should have just vaporized him with his Kamehameha blast when he had the chance. But that's without the context of the book, and the more you read into it, the more you understand the reasoning behind his decisions. The Zonai are, for all intents and purposes, spiritual beings first and foremost. In fact, their culture and doctrines are sort of a blend between Shintoism and Zen Buddhism, where things like nature, wisdom, personal growth, and harmony are considered most important. As such, Raru is kind of a pacifist who doesn't believe in things like war and conquest. His whole quote-unquote empire was built on peace and cooperation, as opposed to military might. A far cry from the more medieval, militaristic Hyrule we see later. Simply killing someone where they stand because they might do something bad in the future goes against everything he stands for and believes in. A lot of people have drawn parallels between Ocarina of Time and this story, mainly because some of the imagery is similar. But the big difference between the two is that Ocarina of Time was preceded by a long, bloody civil war, which the Kingdom of Hyrule ended up winning, while committing quite a few atrocities of their own, I might add. In other words, it was kind of expected that the Gerudo and especially Ganondorf held a grudge against Hyrule, and may someday betray the Hylians. But here, there was no civil war, no unspeakable bloodshed, just a clash of ideas and culture at best. As such, Raru was convinced that just like he was able to sway the other tribes with acts of goodwill, there was hope that he could reach the Gerudo in the same way, that they too would eventually soften up to him and see the benefits of working together, as opposed to making war. And let's be fair, you're not exactly gonna achieve that by killing or at the very least jailing their beloved king, who despite his secret agenda was still greatly admired by his people. In fact, most Gerudo probably weren't even aware that Ganondorf had ulterior motives, and genuinely thought that joining forces with the Kingdom of Hyrule was him doing what's best for his people. In short, challenging Ganondorf at this stage would have surely meant all-out war between the Gerudo and the Hylians, something Raru obviously wanted to avoid at all costs, not just for the sake of his own people, but for the Gerudo as well, most of which clearly weren't evil by any means. Not even mentioning the fact that the Hylians probably would have gotten their asses kicked. I mean, come on, who would you put your money on? A couple of guys with spears and no armor? Or a battle-hardened army of female giants with six-packs, steel swords, and giant f***ing clubs? Yeah, I don't like their odds if I'm completely honest. And you know what, despite being a bit naive and even misguided perhaps, Raru's tactic of appeasement did actually pay off to some extent. Because by the time Ganondorf transforms and starts wasting fools left and right, the Gerudo culture has become so ingrained with the rest of Hyrule that they are no longer willing to go along with it, and have in fact become a target themselves, something we'll see evidence of shortly. So yeah, while it may seem counterintuitive without all the added context, Raru's approach of appeasing Ganondorf as opposed to antagonizing him was probably the most sensible thing he could have done in this situation, even if it did eventually come back to haunt him. And speaking of hauntings, while we don't know much about all the stuff that happened during this peacetime, we do have one in-game record of something that took place shortly before the war, more specifically on stone tablet number 9 titled An Ancient Ghost Story, which was written by the same unnamed servant we talked about previously. Quote, "Of late I've heard it told, a strange lady walks around the castle in the dark of night. She and Princess Zelda seem also twins too, but this one had no light in her eyes, more as a dead thing than not. When she is asked about these walks, Princess Zelda then remembers nothing of that. What monster or spirit of darkness be this vision? So afraid am I of my imagination that I cannot sleep." Unquote. So according to this testimony, the fake Zelda we see in Memory 9, which as we know is a projection of Ganondorf, was not a one-off incident, and reports of a zombie-like doppelganger of the princess wandering the castle grounds at night were allegedly going on for a while. Weeks perhaps, maybe even longer. I'm sure we'll learn more about the goal behind these nightly ventures in Age of Imprisonment, but if I had to make a guess, I'd say that it's probably Ganondorf prying for information on the secret stones. You know, how many there are, who has them, how well protected they are, stuff like that. Perhaps his original plan was to simply steal one of them in the dead of night, without having to resort to violence and blowing his cover prematurely. Or maybe he was just checking to see who would be the easiest target. Who knows? Whatever the case, Ganondorf did end up going for the violent approach, which finally leads to the events from Memories 9 and 10 and the start of the Imprisoning War. The assassination of Queen Sonia was not only a massive blow to Hyrule's seat of power and its morale, it also gave Ganondorf the most powerful tool in his arsenal, the power to literally create armies out of thin air, something he wasn't able to do prior to his transformation. This single newfound ability is what made the entire war possible, as it allowed Ganondorf to take on the entire kingdom of Hyrule at his own volition, free from pesky alliances and loyalty from others. Now he had a near limitless horde of mindless beasts willing to do his bidding without mercy or emotion, which of course he immediately takes advantage of. And it's here that we see the first hint that even at this stage the Gerudo were no longer considered a useful asset to Ganondorf. It's easy to miss because the shots are very brief and saturated in red light, but the Great Plateau is actually not the only target during this first wave of monster attacks. From what we can tell, monsters are spawning all across the kingdom, including the Gerudo Desert, as you can see from the backdrop. Other locations include a snowy area, which is likely somewhere close to Rito Village in Hebra, and some kind of random forest. I'm not sure where this is, but it's worth mentioning that according to the timeline in creating a champion, Zora's domain as we know it should not exist yet, because it clearly states that the Zora moved to Lanayru after the era of myth, aka the time period in which Calamity Ganon was born. I'm a bit skeptical if they will actually remember this part of the lore, since it's only present in one book, but if they do, the Zora home base could be located somewhere else in Age of Imprisonment, maybe at Lake Hylia or something, which is close to the edge of the Faron Woods. Anyway, as the capital came under siege, Rauru, Zelda and the dying Sonia all managed to escape from the castle using the Pura Pad. It's not entirely clear where they teleported to, but seeing as they are at the Forgotten Temple the next time we see them, I imagine that's probably where they went. I doubt that either of them took part in defending the plateau or helped with the evacuations, given the fact that they also have Sonia with them, who's in dire need of medical attention. If true, then it means that the Hylian army had to fend for itself without the help of their king. And as we can read in Masterworks, the Great Plateau ended up falling into enemy hands. Rather quickly, I imagine. Now, the only one whose whereabouts are completely unknown at this time is Minoru. Not even the book mentions where she was or what she was doing when all this went down. So we don't know if she was at the capital when the attack happened, but if she was, it's possible that she played an important role in getting people off the plateau. But we'll just have to wait and see. The book also describes that after the fall of the capital, the Hylian army, or what was left of it anyway, met up at the Forgotten Temple, though it doesn't say how they knew to go there specifically, whether it was part of a contingency plan or if someone got a message out somehow. Again, maybe Minoru had something to do with it, who knows. Next up, in Memory 11, we see Ganondorf summon even more monsters, this time in what looks like the Death Mountain area, judging from the rock formations. My guess is that this scene takes place quite a bit later, probably a while after the Great Plateau was abandoned by the Hylians, and Ganondorf had shifted his attention elsewhere. The cutscene doesn't make it clear who he's preparing to fight here. He sort of just rides into combat all badass looking, and then swings his spear at an invisible enemy. But, I mean, he's got some serious numbers with him, so I imagine it's a pretty significant battle. Maybe against the Gorons, given the location. And yes, I realize that I am speculating quite a bit at this point, which I said I wouldn't do too much, but it's kinda hard not to when both the game and the book leave out so many details, so apologies for that. And speaking of leaving things out, we basically have no idea how most of the other tribes fared against these attacks, whether they were able to stand their ground, or if they too had to abandon their homes and flee. In fact, the only piece of information we get regarding the status of the war is in the next memory, a Sage's Vow. Here we can see that at least parts of the Hylian army have since made it to the Forgotten Temple. Furthermore, Minoru has also made it here by this time, as did the chiefs of the 4 other tribes, who were summoned here by Rauru to discuss a strategy. It's during this meeting that we get to hear the one and only damage report, namely that the last free village in the Gerudo region has fallen.
We just received word that the last free village in the Gerudo Desert has fallen.
We don't get any updates on the Zora, Gorons or Rito, so again, it remains to be seen what their fate was. Though the fact that we don't hear anything about them here, nor in the book, does at least suggest that their towns and villages were spared up to this point. Another obvious detail to point out is of course the sudden presence of a Gerudo chieftain. In the present day it's standard fare that the Gerudo have a chief instead of a king or queen, but obviously back then Ganondorf was king. The game just sorta skips over this, what I would argue is a pretty significant development, but the book explains that after Ganondorf became the Demon King, he was almost immediately disavowed by his people, and so the Gerudo appointed a new individual of great power as their chieftain, who immediately joined forces with the Hylians. Now, as we know from the game, it's also here that Rauru unveils the 4 remaining secret stones and bestows them upon the 4 chiefs, marking the formation of the 6 sages, or 7 sages if you also count Rauru himself. In the next memory, A King's Duty, we're still at the Forgotten Temple. However, only Rauru and Zelda remain at this point, who briefly discuss the upcoming confrontation with Ganondorf and how Rauru is willing to give his life for the future of his kingdom, foreshadowing his inevitable sacrifice. From here on out, the game leaves a lot to the imagination because, well, next thing we know, they're in that basement where Link and Zelda find Ganondorf's corpse at the beginning of the game, and are facing off against the Demon King in a 7-on-1 battle. The game never explains how or why they ended up all the way down here, which begs the question, what happened between the Forgotten Temple cutscene and the final standoff? Well, the next part is entirely from the book, so we'll just have to wait and see how accurate this ends up being. But apparently the Hylian army, possibly with the help of the other tribes, actually managed to recapture the Great Plateau. They marched all the way from the Forgotten Temple to the capital and just took it back, albeit at a great cost. Many soldiers allegedly died during this fight. However, rather than staying at the capital and continuing to defend it, they instead retreated again and moved north towards the Temple of Light. And by they I mean all 7 sages plus whatever was left of the armed forces at that point. Also, for those who are confused, the Temple of Light is the very same building we explored during the opening segment of Tears of the Kingdom, the foundation upon which Hyrule Castle would be built in the future. Now, it remains to be seen what exactly the strategy or the expectation was behind this whole mission of taking back the capital and then leaving again, whether it was part of a deliberate plan or if they simply weren't able to hold it against subsequent attacks. But what we do know is that the reason they moved to the Temple of Light, instead of falling back to the Forgotten Temple or any other stronghold, is that there was allegedly some kind of sacred energy present at this site, energy which gave Rauru and the sages an advantage of sorts. So the idea was to lure Ganondorf towards and into this building to even out the odds. Kinda like fighting a vampire on holy ground, I guess. It's also stated that the surviving army of Hyrule played a key role in this maneuver. Rauru gambled on the idea that Ganondorf's pride would likely motivate him to take the bait, which of course he did. In fact, he was so confident in his inevitable victory that he traveled into the depths of the temple alone, unaccompanied by any of his minions. And that is how they all ended up down here for the final battle, which, as we saw in Memory 13, didn't exactly go as expected. Even with this so-called advantage provided by these sacred grounds, they were completely outmatched against Ganondorf, who possessed both the speed, strength, spirit, and sturdiness to contest anything the sages threw at him. By the end, with all of them wounded and exhausted, a desperate Rauru uses the final ace up his sleeve, a special technique known as the Heart Grab. Here he steals the dark energy from his opponent's heart, detoxifies it inside of his own body, and then expels it from his back in the form of a green spiral, or light energy. This purification process renders Ganondorf's body completely immobile. However, the same goes for Rauru himself. Unable to move, the two will remain locked in a perpetual standoff for many millennia to come, ending the Imprisoning War, but at the cost of the first king of Hyrule. Of course, this is not where the story ends, and I doubt Age of Imprisonment will just abruptly end here either. I'm sure we'll get to see at least some of what happened after the dust settled, though how much we'll just have to wait and see. We of course know what Zelda's fate is, as well as what happened to Minoru, but it remains to be seen how much of the events after the Imprisoning War they are willing to show, or retell in some cases, given that we already saw it in Tears of the Kingdom. Same goes for the stuff that happens before the war. We know from the teaser footage that some of it takes place right after Zelda arrived in the ancient past, given the outfit she wears in some of the shots, so who knows where the story will pick up. Maybe we'll get a glimpse of the pilgrimage of exorcism. I kinda doubt it, but hey, a man can dream. And that, my friends, is, well, almost everything we know about the Imprisoning War. I did leave out a few details for the sake of pacing, but I think I covered most of the key events that are relevant to the war. And if you want to learn more, you can of course always pick up Masterworks for yourself. Yes, it is in Japanese, but trust me when I say that you can actually get pretty far with just Google Translate, though there are some great fan translations out there as well. The translation I used was done by LivixBobiex. Sorry if I butchered that, but yeah, a big thanks to them for their amazing work and for sharing their knowledge with others for free. It's something you always love to see in the Zelda community. Oh, and speaking of Masterworks, I think there's a fairly good chance that we'll get an English edition of the book prior to Age of Imprisoment's release this winter. I mean, it did take less than a year for creating a champion to be localized, and seeing as this book came out in August 2024, we could be due for an English version sometime after the summer of this year. Here's hoping. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. A big shout out to the mods on Discord, my Patreons, and of course my channel members. Your support is still greatly appreciated. That is all for now, and I hope to see you all next time.